Let's finish up chapter 13 and get into the Aztec Empire. Now, I'm using the word empire here. We haven't really discussed this yet. I personally work on another empire in Mesopotamia. I'm part of a project called the Akkadian Empire Project with Yale University that looks into the formation of what's considered to be the earliest empire. But what does that mean? What is an empire? We've been looking at complex chiefdoms, we've been looking at urbanization, we've been looking at early state formation, been looking at territorial identities. But we haven't really considered the word empire yet. Isn't that just another territorial identity? Isn't that just another state-level identity? Well, in a way, yes, but it's one that expands larger than just a closed, geographically isolated group of people that has a similar language, similar religious practices, similar culture, and is one that is expansive and includes multiple state-level identities within a much larger, broader identity and organizational system. So an empire is one stage larger than a state, again. It follows many of the same principles, though. So it's part of our discussion of state formation, and we didn't consider the Akkadian Empire because this is about prehistory. And if you recall what prehistory is, it's once writing comes in, then we consider it to be a historical period. And the Akkadian Empire uses the kind of cuneiform scripts that were invented and used in the early states of Mesopotamia. The Mayans had writing, as we saw, but we also have another primary state formation that took place somewhat later. Actually, it's not really a primary state; it's a primary empire formation. But what it is actually a secondary state formation. If you recall, my description of secondary state formation is the same process of forming a state-level identity, but with the knowledge of states that had either come before it or that were contemporary with it, and so some sort of a co-development. So the Aztec Empire is secondary state formation, but it is the first empire that we see in Mesoamerica. Let's look a little bit at the information of this. Now, I also say that this is prehistory. They actually do bring in, they have their own script, their own language, and also this is the culture that was encountered by the Europeans who first came to colonize the New World, North and South America, in the 15th and 16th centuries. And in 1521, the Aztecs were taken over by the Spanish and defeated finally, although there had been some communication before that. So the Aztec Empire, if you look at your timeline that I've got on the slideshow for this, it's one of the later phases of what we're talking about here, but overlaps with and actually overlaps chronologically, but also geographically with some of the areas. And so they were familiar with some of the cities and monuments that had come before them, even if those were long gone at that point. And in fact, they were aware of one of the first cities that we encountered here, Teotihuacan, and they considered this to be a place that was built by gods. So the Aztec were aware of the cultures that had come before them and built on top of that. But as we're going to see, a unique set of circumstances of movement of people and in a geographical area created a system where it wasn't just a state that formed, but it was multiple identities all subsumed under this larger empire attribution. The largest city in Mesoamerica when the Europeans came would have been very impressive to them. This was Tenochtitlan, which was the capital of the Aztec Empire, and it was built on Lake Texcoco in the Valley of Mexico. This is where modern Mexico City is, which has all completely eliminated the lake that was once there. And it was built on a series of sort of man-made islands and causeways connected to the mainland, and it would have been an impressive sight by any standards. And they would have also experienced the sort of mature, full empire at its height, including things like their religious practices, which we'll get into a little bit here, including the twin pyramids of Templo Mayor in its spiritual center in the city. Aztec writing, few of the Aztec writings survive. They had illustrated books, and we had some communications from the Aztecs, but the Spanish conquerors destroyed a lot of this. They wanted to tell the story of their conquered peoples themselves. The Spanish wanted to Christianize and to westernize these people and subjugate them. And they wanted to eliminate any of their so-called pagan practices. And so you had a reinterpretation of who these people were that has heavily influenced our historical understanding of the Aztecs, which is why archaeology is important, because archaeology looks broader than just the historical documents and actually looks at the material remains from the past. And so one of these very important European texts that has colored our understanding of the Aztecs is what's the so-called Florentine Codex. And this was written by a Spanish friar, Friar Bernardo de Sahagún, who actually interviewed and recorded in the native Nahuatl language, the Aztec language, and in Spanish. And so he became fluent in both of these languages, and he included illustrations by indigenous artists. So this is actually one of the rare instances where a European chronicler of the Aztecs was actually fairly faithful to indigenous perspectives, although we can't fully trust this because he was also a Christian friar from Spain. So his perspective is also embedded in this, and unfortunately few of the illustrated books prior to European colonization exist or survived. So what do we know about the Aztecs? We do know, as I said, the Florentine Codex does record some of the indigenous people's perspectives, but we can't fully trust them. We've got to test those against the archaeological record. And so what we do know is that it was inhabiting an area that actually had prior peoples living there. In particular, the Olmec, whom we've looked at before, and Teotihuacan. Many thousands of years earlier, though. And in fact, the Aztec name Nahuatl is the name for Teotihuacan, which means the place built by the gods. So even their conception of who they were is about this inheriting this legacy from their previous inhabitants of this land, who importantly weren't their ancestors. They also drew from a culture we haven't really looked at yet, or we haven't looked at, is the Toltec, who are somewhat later than the Olmec. And the city of Tula was in this area, had a population of about 50,000 people. But the Aztecs actually considered themselves to have come from outside. They consider themselves to have been migrants that moved into the area. This is entirely possible, archaeologically speaking, but their homeland, the origin of their homeland, and where that might possibly be, which they called Aztlan, is unknown. And we just have to assume that it's mythological. Going around hunting for the mythical Aztlan is a fool's errand. Because the way that it's told in the mythology of the Aztecs is filled with gods and mythological things that can't possibly have happened. So trying to follow this mythological text, this mythology like a map, is going to lead you nowhere, pretty much. And in fact, the modern Mexican flag refers to this myth, which as the inhabitants of Aztlan were moving out of their homeland, they caught a vision of an eagle on a cactus. And that image is still depicted on the flag of Mexico. And as we'll see, Mexico itself finds its origins in the Aztec archaeological origin story. So the history of the Aztecs begins really from we see migrations of people moving into this valley of Mexico from about AD 1200 to about 1250, and so a period of time where there seems to be high mobility of people. And why is that? It could be something like environmental changes or disasters or marginal areas. It could be warfare. We've seen from some places that we've already looked at in Mesoamerica, there was a lot of conflict. The Mayan in particular were warriors and had some bloodletting rituals as part of their spiritual belief system. We don't know exactly the reason why these migrations were happening, but there are ideas about it. The first wave of these into the Valley of Mexico took place, as I said, about 1200 AD into the Valley of Mexico proper, and it seems to have, they dominated some of the best parts and started to inhabit that place. The second wave of migrations settled some of the surrounding valleys around the Valley of Mexico. And the third wave was the Mexica people from Mexico, I should say, to some of the more marginal areas, filling in the gaps between this valley, this place, and that place. The migration of this final wave in particular seems to have been due to attacks from groups like the Tepanetecs and the Cuelacans. The Mexica eventually allied with Cuelacan. So they were driven out, but eventually the Mexica people that were moving into the Aztec region then allied themselves with their former enemies. They did this through one of the rulers of this Mexica group that moved in, created an alliance between Cuelacan and Huitzilopochtli, who was the Mexica leader. So they married Cuelacan, married his daughter off to Huitzilopochtli. But actually she was sacrificed as a process of this. But that marriage created an alliance, a bond between these two leaders that then created a military and forceful alliance between the two groups. And this is sort of how the ball gets rolling. When you have conflict, when you have marginal areas, when you have movement of peoples, you're vulnerable. And so if you can strike an alliance with a couple of different groups that are both vulnerable, then you become more powerful together. Now, working out who's in charge of that alliance is sometimes tricky, but it means that you're more competitive against the other groups that are in that area. So the Aztec Empire was avoiding these conflicts through what we call the Triple Alliance of Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan groups. And by 1428, this Triple Alliance was established. And the victors in this, the people who sort of rose to the top of this group, were the Mexica. Even though they were the last to arrive into the area and they were the ones who settled into the sort of marginal areas, they struck an alliance fairly early on, which allowed them to expand their power and dominate this region. The Tenochtitlan city became the urban power in this area, and they built Templo Mayor on the islands on Lake Texcoco that became the sort of spiritual center of this culture as well. And so that again created this ideological hierarchy. You have the empire and you have the people in charge. You have multiple groups that are all subjugated and subservient to the dominant group. But this is also reflected in mythology and spirituality and religion, with the Templo Mayor, the big temple in Tenochtitlan, being the principal, the expression of that same hierarchy on a cosmic level, on a mythological level, on a religious, spiritual level. The economy held together through again, this dependency. And so an urban center needs food supply to support their population that's growing. And so they dominated their surrounding landscapes and also the towns and villages that were outside of the city. And so you had this tiered settlement hierarchy as well, and bringing in food to the capital and then sending it back out. And so you have there are codices that survive that show that food was required as tribute. So these chinampas, terraces, and valley irrigation were used to create food for the smaller villages, but they had to kick some of these up as taxes to the big city. And what did they get for it in return? They got protection from all of this potential warfare that could have been taking place. And also they bought into it because it was part of their understanding of the way the world and even the universe worked. And so you also had craft production in the outlying towns as well, not just foodstuffs. Otumba and Quexcomate and Capilco all produce products like obsidian, this volcanic glass that can be used for blades, textiles, ceramics, and basalt, very hard stone for grinding tools and things like that. And the Aztec Empire also, as I said, it had a unifying message of the way the universe operated through their mythology. Coatlicue is sort of a central figure in their mythology. She was a woman who lived in a mountain top. Coatepec was the name of that mountain, and she had 400 children. And she gave birth she was impregnated by a ball of feathers, and she gave birth to Huitzilopochtli. And he's the Aztec patron deity. He's the sort of their head god. But the Coatlicue is one of her daughters who saw her giving birth to Huitzilopochtli and became enraged and tried to convince all of her siblings to kill this new son. But to her surprise, Huitzilopochtli was born fully clothed in battle armor and ready for war, and he decapitated his sister Huitzilopochtli with a snake, and then hunted down and killed all of his remaining siblings. So their patron deity is kind of a rough guy. So this sort of sets the stage for some of the things we'll see. This is you don't try and question authority, right? This is the being impregnated by a ball of feathers is something that is divine, and he was of divine birth. And so you can't, even if you're the sister of this of Huitzilopochtli, you're not allowed to challenge that authority. And so this is reflected in their monuments that they build, that authority is divinely instated, and that also that on a mythological level, but also on a very secular and practical level for your governance and who rules you as well. So what happens in the secular world is also reflected in the sacred architecture as well. And so Templo Mayor constructed double pyramids in several stages of construction, 2 temples of Tlaloc and Huitzilopochtli, and you find all sorts of paraphernalia, religious paraphernalia, skull masks and things, and the details of this architecture retell this story that I just went through of Huitzilopochtli, that myth, and illustrates the dismembered body of Huitzilopochtli, his slain sister. And so when the Europeans came, this is what they were encountering. They were seeing this very violent, very pretty harsh mythology and spirituality that the colonizers were somewhat horrified by. And in fact, that was kind of part of the point, was to what they documented, and which may very well be true, was things like ritual sacrifices of human sacrifices, in fact, which to the Aztec way of thinking ensured the continuation of a universe, because these victims would be turned into deities. And so you're constantly supplying the universe with an influx of gods. But it only occurred in the urban areas. It didn't occur in the rural areas. So your experience with this would just be one of rumor if you lived in a little village. If you were part of the elite that was actually doing the sacrifice,